Good morning, or good afternoon, good evening, everyone from wherever you are. Welcome to this webinar series, jointly organized by the World Bank, UNESCO, UNICEF, and UNESCO Institute of Statistics. It's my pleasure to welcome you all today to the presentation of what has been, I think, a remarkable effort across these organizations, essentially to try to understand how countries, and specifically ministries of education, have been responding to what everybody now recognizes to be an unprecedented crisis affecting every form of our lives, but particularly very, very hard education systems across the world. As everybody knows, school closures have been massive. The impacts on learning quite significant, has been documented now by several studies. And then, of course, the question is, how are countries trying to grapple with these impacts? I first of all want to thank our partners from UNICEF, UNESCO, and UIS. You can see in the screen, it has been a very, very large team working across the organizations in this joint effort. And what today we will have is a presentation of the main findings, essentially to give you a preview of the results and encourage you to actually read the report, which is now available online. So we will structure our session in three parts. After my initial remarks, I'll pass it on to Matt Brossard, who's the Chief of Education of UNICEF Office of Research, and Sylvia, our friend Sylvia Montoya from UIS. Then we will move into a session with the actual presentation of the results, which will be chaired, moderated by Sobi Tawil, the Director of the Future of Learning and Innovation in UNESCO. And several colleagues there will present the main findings. And then we will have some concluding remarks and some initial ideas of what the next steps are from our colleagues, Nicolas Rouge from UNICEF and João Pedro Acevedo from our team at the World Bank. So again, a pleasure to be here. We hope you enjoy the presentation. Please do actively participate in the chat while the presentations are going, but particularly during the session on questions and answers. We will be monitoring the chat and we'll make sure we surface your questions to the panelists. So without further ado, again, welcome, and I'll pass it now to Matt. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Omar, and welcome everybody. I'm Matt Brossard, Chief of Education Unit at the Office of Research, as Omar mentioned, where I have the honor to coordinate a great team of about 20 qualitative and quantitative researchers. I'm sure you are all impatient to see the findings of the report, but we thought that it would be a good idea to first share what we have learned about partnerships through this collaboration. It has been a fabulous journey so far to work with all those great colleagues from the three organizations, and really huge thanks to all of them for the fantastic and hard work and collaborative spirit. And on a personal note, it's also a pleasure for me because I have spent the first third of my career at UNESCO and UIS, the second third at the World Bank, and the last and current third part of my career at UNICEF, both in New York and in Office of Research now. So what have we learned in terms of partnership? What made this collaboration really genuine and effective, able to produce this joint report in record time? I mean, we should keep in mind that we received the last answer from countries only 2 weeks ago. So it was a very effective effort and joint effort. And we thought we could share 6 points of what we thought was the success factors of this collaboration. First, I mean, coming to what are the usual bottlenecks to make partnership not working or not genuine or not effective. The really stubborn habit of working in silos across organizations and also within organizations, unfortunately. But what made, in our case, what made the partnership successful in that regard is really this common understanding that it was not the time for ministries of education to reply to multiple uncoordinated data collection. I mean, there are probably better things to think about in this crisis time. So there was a strong rationale of a joint work and leading to a global public good. Second, there is usually in many partnerships a lack of internal incentive, each organization being focused on their own agenda and their own processes. In our case, we were lucky to be supported by the senior management of each organization, which really helped. We also were progressive in the collaboration. As an example, in round one, we designed a survey together, but it was still like different report from the different organization with peer review of the other, but still different report from the different organization showing the result of the round one. Round two, we said, let's do something together. And that's why we are here today. Third, the lack of funding. Sometimes there is uncoordinated funding, lack of funding. In that case, we mutualize. To give a couple of examples from UNICEF side, we use an education thematic fund that is mainly funded by Norway, and other internal resources for the cost in terms of research staff time and the cost in terms of graphic design that we took care of. UNESCO, I know I've used the GP COVID fund, and I'm sure World Bank has used their own internal resources as well. So there were a real mutualization of resources. Four, differences in views and processes. That's common things in partnership. Of course, every organization have different views. But really, again, like the spirit, the collaboration spirit, the willingness to compromise, to build consensus, to land to something was really bigger than those differences. I mean, there are many examples. We don't have the time to speak about them, but there were many like that. Standardizing also data cleaning, analytical processes, and I know João Pedro from the World Bank will also speak about the GitHub, for example, this tool for working together. Fifth, visibility competition, a usual thing we see. 25 years I work in the sector, I always seen that competition between organizations and for visibility and other purpose. What we decided in our case is really to have joint visibility, acknowledging, sorry about that, all. And six, the coordination challenges. It's usual, it's difficult to work. The expression, many cooks in the kitchen is something that can be impeding a true, genuine partnership. In our case, we use modern tools, workspace, including shared folder, files, data, stata code, sorry. And it was really effective and efficient in a way that we prevent to have parallel version of document, of draft, etc., etc. And of course, we use a lot of regular meeting at least on a weekly basis. So I will stop here and give the floor to Sylvia, the director of UIS, to explain us to summarize the survey data and response overview. Over to you, Sylvia. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Omar. Thank you so much, and good morning, good afternoon, good day for everybody. Thank you so much for being with us. On the side of the UIS and on behalf of my team, we have been administering and trying to actually to bring and to do our part in terms of this excellent collaboration. There is nothing more that I could add to what has been already highlighted, because it has been an extraordinary and well-coordinated effort. So I would like to talk a little bit about more technical aspects that are the ones that are related, to get a little bit into the business now, and then just to set the floor for the discussion of the results. We have administered this survey so far in 2 phases. And we have administered the first one when the COVID outbreak was kind of in the first wave, and we have trying to understand some of the basic issues about the learning discontinuity, the distant learning. And this was the phase of April to June. We have collected a good numbers of countries. I will go into that. And then, as we have seen, that there are many issues that still we needed to understand, that there were many questions that they were really not answered, and our need to understand and to know how to better support and to guide everybody's effort at the international level, and obviously to try to learn from what you are doing at the country level. We administered a second iteration of the survey from July to October. Obviously, we have been caught by the break of the summer in the northern hemisphere, and this actually was extended and having a very good coverage that I will get into detail. The questionnaire, who is the one who is answering, is a very important question. So we actually try to address the questionnaire for ministers of education. At the Minister of Education, the officials at the central or upper highest level in charge of the school education systems. And we have contacted both the Ministries of Education and the statistical planning units, that are the ones who are usually respondents of the UIS formal education survey, has been actually contacted, and we have been following with them to try to actually to get the answers. In terms of the language and the data collection mechanism, I just want to say that we have administered in 4 languages in the first case of the first phase, and we have extended to include Arabic in the second iteration, and it has been part as a multilingual team. We have everybody trying to collaborate, and we have been able to have 5 languages in the second iteration. And we have submitted the survey by mail, but we have an online platform. We have actually gotten responses even online, or we have gotten responses by mail. So we have tried to be flexible and try to have on our side the effort to try to go into the coordination of how we do the data entry of the data, and try to put as soon as possible the survey in a format that could be actually shared with all the partners for the analysis of the data. So if we can go to the next slide, please. In terms of the survey structure, and it has been actually a collaboration and consultation inside each of the organization, and even trying to actually to hear and to coordinate with other partners that are actually trying to analyze with the phenomenon and what are the responses, and some sister organizations. We actually try to put a questionnaire that is at the same time short, but is collecting enough information to actually to give us a take of what is happening in some of the areas that we have actually taken as outstanding in terms of the needs and demands of advice, and our own understanding of guiding better the efforts of the development partners and the international community. So the main topics that we have attended in terms of organizing the survey has been in the case of the 2 surveys, we have 8 major topics that they actually have gone about the reopening of the school. What are the issues of school calendars? Are the school calendar extended? How are going to be the breaks? Are classes starting earlier as planned in the case that the classes has already finished the school year and they are planning for the following school year? What are the distance learning mechanisms into place? What are the delivery? What are the contents chosen? What are the platforms? What are even the evaluation of some of the distance learning strategies has been chosen? And we have dedicated questions to teachers, students, and parents and caregivers to actually to try to understand what are the specific in each of the cases, and including how is going to be not only the end of the year evaluated and how is going to be determined the completion and the promotion of a given grade or school year, but also the formative assessment that are into place given that the use of distance learning mechanism has to be actually administered by most of the countries in the world. And in the second iteration, we actually have the clear understanding that the financing and the funding is a critical issue in terms of the service. So we have added this additional topic to the eight other ones that we have administered in both surveys. And now, as we're considering a 3rd iteration and a 3rd phase, because we're aiming to administer this survey on a quarterly basis to try to understand how to better serve the countries and how to better guide the investment and the decisions in terms of the advice to policy making, we're trying to keep a very short and to the point a survey that is going to be administered on the quarterly basis, and trying to keep on some of the issues. We're going to be actually starting tomorrow to try to define the structure of the next iteration of the survey, and trying to see what are the issues that have appeared as a consequence of these findings. So if we can go to the next slide. It's just a very first and quick snapshot, and you will have some details that I'm not going to go into detail in the next slide because you can then download the presentation and have the numbers and look at details of the numbers in terms of response rates. This is a coverage we have gotten in terms of the countries. As you could see, we have in the first survey, we have gotten 124 countries that have across 8 regions that have replied to the survey. And we have also classified, as you will see the results, according to also level of income, according to the World Bank classification. In the second iteration of the survey, you saw that we have 150 countries that are already replying to the survey. And this means obviously coverage in terms of the 3 main aggregates that are the ones that are relevant in terms of the school systems, to look at the number of schools that are covered by the different iteration of the service, the number of enrollment, that are the students that are covered by the response of the country who have replied, and also the teachers that are according to SDG 4 region classification. In all of the cases we have gotten in the 2 iterations, a very good number of countries that are actually allowing us to have a fair interpretation, not an exhaustive, not detailed, because we don't have every country, but you have a very good coverage of the countries to allow us to make some recommendations to get a sense of what are the most prevalent problems and what are the successes also that we can read from the answers to the survey. So if we can go to the next slide. We have some resources and the colleague that they were all working closely, and you will find all the resources are shared. You have that there is a dedicated place in the UIS microsite in the Technical Cooperation Group to Education 2030. You have a dedicated micro page to the COVID response, and you have infograms that we have put together for the first iteration of the survey, for the second iteration of the survey that has been released last week, along with the publication. We have the data is available there. You have the data available in Excel. You have the code book as announced and just flagged by Matt. We have worked together, all the code books, all the cleaning criteria, all the collaboration, all the codes that Joao Pedro will describe later on, has been actually worked together by all the 3 organizations, and has been an excellent and very efficient work. We have a technical note as is pertained that every survey needs to have a description of a technical note that is also available in a PDF link, and obviously you have the report. You are invited to visit the microsite and all the other resources that we are going to be sharing and adding in each of the 3 organizations, and I am cordially inviting you to keep on bearing with us and reply to our next iteration of the survey. It's very important for us to be serving you better. So we depend and we learn from you. So please bear with us and just be with us for the next iteration of the survey. On my side, that's all. And Sobi, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all colleagues. Omar, for giving the introduction from the World Bank. Matt Brossard from UNICEF Innocenti Research Office for recalling this experience of working jointly together, and this is perhaps one of the positive impacts of this COVID crisis disruption and our response. And Sylvia for giving an overview of the survey itself and the type of data. There were a few questions in the chat, but I think that we can respond to them in the chat, and the information would be there. There were questions around which countries and particular regions participated. If there are other surveys, since this survey is focused on school education, if there are other surveys, and there clearly is on TVET and skills development, a joint ILO UNESCO World Bank survey, on higher education, at least that I'm aware of the International Association of Universities, but we can send that information. There was one question about positioning, the importance of having schools open despite the COVID-19, but as was suggested, this will come in the last segment of the presentation. And what I would like to propose is that we move on to the presenting the data from the different segments. We will do it in 3 parts, as was announced. The first presentation will be around learning loss and mitigating learning loss, and we have Amer Hassan from the World Bank, more or less 10-minute presentation. We will take 10 minutes after that for any questions and answers, and then we'll move on to the second segment on remote learning and policy support to teachers and parents. Again, a little bit longer, that presentation, 15 minutes. We'll take 15 minutes also for questions and answers. And finally, to the reopening of schools, so managing the reopening, but also the question of financing. So in 3 segments, I recall that we do have interpretation in French and Spanish and English. And please do share your questions and comments in the chat, and we will attempt to address them after the end of each of the 3 presentations. So let's start with the first one on mitigating learning loss, and over to Amer Hassan from the World Bank.
Thank you very much, Sobi. Thank you all for joining us this morning, this afternoon, this evening, wherever you may be. And thank you all to my colleagues as well for making this presentation possible. The subject of our report is what have we learned? And frankly, speaking from personal experience, I've learned a great deal. And this morning, what we would like to do is start with describing a central question that goes into this question about learning loss. So what exactly, how long were schools closed? So what we did was we were able to ask all the governments that responded, not just how long the schools had been closed, but also marry that information with information we have on the school years, on their planned breaks. And we learned, the first thing that we learned was that there is a great deal of variety across the globe in terms of what school closures meant for our students and for our children. So in this chart, what you see is a very small collection of countries, some from the same region, that have experienced very different degrees of school closures. And what's important to see in this chart is the blue lines are academic years, the orange lines are breaks essentially, and whether it's a summer break or a winter break partly depends on which hemisphere the country is in. And you can see that the gray bars are the amounts of days that countries reported schools were closed. And what becomes apparent here is that even within a certain region, so if you look at some of the examples here within East Asia, for example, you have very small amounts of school closure in country A that happened in the middle of a school closure. That happened in the middle of a school year. And in other cases, you have school closures that sort of bleed into breaks. So ultimately, that's going to mean very different things for when we study, we try and sort of unpack learning loss. So that this, I think, gives us a clear example of sort of some of the information that this exercise is able to tell us. This disparity is not just apparent across regions, it's also apparent across income groups. Thank you. And so in this chart, you have the same information sort of unbundled by income group. But one thing that becomes very clear is if you unpack this into countries that had already finished an academic year versus countries where an academic year was ongoing, there's a big difference in how many days of school closure were reported. So predominantly the countries where the school year had ended up being in the Northern Hemisphere. On average, this meant children lost 40 days of instruction in school. Whereas in the Southern Hemisphere, where the academic year was more likely to be ongoing, on average, you see the children, governments reporting that children lost about 55 days. So there's a great deal of heterogeneity, not just across income groups, but also in terms of, So the lost opportunities for learning, then ultimately, one thing we can see is that the share of the school year that was planned varies greatly. So on the low income end of the spectrum, when we look at countries, the 16 low income countries that responded, about a third of the school year was lost. Similarly for the lower middle income group in our data set. But on the higher end of the income spectrum, we have about 15% of the school year was being lost. On average, across the world, for the 108 countries that responded to this particular item, you had a quarter of the school year being lost around the globe.
Amer, are you?
Sorry, I believe that's my last slide.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. A couple of questions, perhaps that have come in. There's been response to them too, but one question: any specific focus on the survey in terms of learners with disabilities? Given that much of the distance learning response, and we'll hear more about that, has been online, and that is in particular difficult. And if the survey did look beyond formal schooling and consider non-formal programs. Amer, if you'd like to come in, it could also be other colleagues, all colleagues involved actually in the survey. But Amer, if you would like a first go.
Actually, I think this might be better for Sylvia.
Yes, hello. No, I mean, we were looking at the disability. It was a question, and it was a possibility to elaborate on this. I think that is one of the issues that we have to try to put for the next iteration of the survey, to try to look at this in more detail. About the non-formal responses, I mean, as much as the officials in government could actually have to address about issues regarding some programs or the existence of this type of mechanism, but in general it was focused on the official responses and the kind of how government was facing on these responses. But we have the possibility to go into an open elaboration of the answers.
Amer, if I may, correct to say that I mean it's on average it's between a third and a fourth of the school year that's been lost. But it's lower middle income and low income countries that were most affected by lost school days.
But definitely. And I think one of the questions that we'll get to in a subsequent section is also the question around how well governments felt that the opportunities that they were able to provide in lieu of in-person school training, how well that was a sort of complete substitute for what the children missed out on by going to school. So it's not just the actual physical days they were unable to go. In a lot of cases, you see governments were able to put in place other arrangements to ensure there was continuity in learning. But even there, you see a great deal of variation in terms of what governments themselves felt, how effective that ended up being, given the sort of emerging crisis that everybody was dealing with.
Perhaps one more question on what else would be required to monitor learning loss, and what mitigation strategies?
Sure. So I'm sure many of our audience have been paying attention to the work that is being produced, not just by the World Bank, but also by the other agencies on this webinar. And we've been trying to capture exactly the scale and the extent of what learning loss might look like, because it's not just a question of how many days of school were lost. It's also a function of how well children were able to access all the materials that governments were trying to provide them in lieu of in-person school time. It's also a function of how harsh the crisis ended up being within their household. And so how much were they able to actually carve out time and space to engage with that material? So I think what we are trying to grapple with, and there's a lot of work ongoing, is to collect actual data on learning outcomes in different pockets across the globe, and trying to gather that information up to paint a picture of the actual magnitude of what children still remember, or what children still are able to tell us they understand from the material that they were learning. And again, the fact that for some children this happened during a school year versus some children at the end of a school year is going to have far-reaching implications, not just for the aggregate, but also for inequalities we know exist across countries and across groups.
Great, thanks, Amer. There are two more comments, but one I think we'll take in the next session, but one still relative to learning loss and the implications economically, and we know that the World Bank has done some work on that, and I think the link to that report has been shared. What are the longer term implications in terms of earnings and impact on growth? Another question, but this will relate and this will give us a transition into our next segment, is does online learning and to what extent does online learning count or not as part of learning loss? So I would like to, if you allow, that we move on to the next segment. The next segment covers quite a substantive part of the survey data that was collected on remote learning and what can be done to improve online learning and policies to support teachers and parents. So we will have a presentation with a couple of colleagues. So first from the World Bank, Kali Azihuk, and from UNESCO, my colleague, Maya Prince. So presentation of about 15 minutes. And again, I encourage all participants to put in your questions in the chat. We will take also 10 to 15 minutes after that presentation to address those specific questions. So over to you, Kali.
Thank you, Subhi. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm ready to go if you want to move to the next slide. Excellent. Thanks. So the section covers, as Subhi explained, on the key findings that we have on remote learning. So I'll try and go over the highlights of the report, though there is quite a bit of rich data that delves into the next levels that we won't cover in this slide. So in brief, basically all countries who responded to the survey said they offered some form of remote learning to mitigate learning loss, to ensure continuity of learning. Now nearly 90% of them used online platforms. That might seem like a surprising number, especially for low-income countries, but we can talk about sort of the effectiveness in each. So the online was used in low-income countries in about 64%, so nearly 2/3 of countries still used online, although we know from other surveys, as I mentioned in other data, that the reach and the access of these platforms was not universal across countries and then also within communities. Now, in terms of inclusion, and I saw there was a question in the chat on this, there were some considerations for students with disabilities. There were considerations to ensure disadvantaged groups were included, socioeconomic, rural, urban, etc. But it basically, not everyone was able to offer those kinds of considerations. Only about half, and you see from the chart that they vary, from the data that they vary across the income countries of income. Now, there were also 40% of respondents said that ministries and systems created self-paced learning platforms. This worked better in countries across higher income parameters. So I'll move to the next one. Annette? Okay, great. Is this slide here? Is this slide two? Okay, thank you, Annette. Sorry, my system must be a little bit delayed. No, please go back. Please go back. Okay, I'll keep going. So high income countries basically focused on the expansion of online learning. Basically, we have examples from Europe and Central Asia, where there was subsidies for internet fees. There were expansion of being able to access learning through online phones that was not available before. So that kind of platform was expanded significantly, and we have to say in a short time frame. These options, again, were not surprisingly limited to high-income countries. Low-income countries, due to results, to resources and infrastructure, were not able to offer this. Now, as a way to ensure continuity, but maybe focus on the essentials, many systems dropped non-core subjects. But also, as you know, and we've also noted in the chat, many systems also focused on key cohorts of students or classes, those preparing for standardized examinations or those at key grades. So while there was universal sort of platform offerings, it did not target everybody. Okay. Now, on the perceived effectiveness, the emphasis here is on perceived because this survey is focused on who is supplying the learning. We do have additional data on the uptake, if you will. And even among the responding countries, there seem to be mixed reviews across. Within high-income countries, they found online learning seemed to be the most effective. It was the most easily offered, the most versatile, and there was already the platforms and infrastructure to build on. The low-income countries, also again, we said there's, everyone offered something nearly. It wasn't very effective with the exception of radio. And this was across many countries in Africa, for example, and some in South Asia. The accessibility was probably due to the fact that that's basically what you had on hand. And given how quickly schools closed, there wasn't enough time to move to anything that's more complex. Okay, so basically our sort of conclusions are on this is what we found in the survey and is also in reality is that remote learning has changed the landscape of how education is offered. Based on the sort of respondents, we know that also with the reopening of schools, which is now about, I think 80% of the countries have reopened, they are using hybrid systems. So high income countries find when we address loss of learning, can we count remote learning as a way to mitigate it? And does it get us towards the learning outcomes that we need? So because 91% of them are using it or will incorporate it into learning this year, it's important to know that while remote learning can supplement the sort of effectiveness of learning and does mitigate learning loss, it also increases, and we've seen this in the survey, the disadvantages and will likely widen the gap. So there is, as the chart says, there is the inequities in access to technologies. So those groups that are already at a disadvantage are likely to be at a greater disadvantage. And I will now turn it over to my colleague, Maya.
Thanks, Kelly. So now we move on to teachers who are playing a pivotal role during this crisis. In a way, the success of these distance learning platforms depends partly on how effectively they're able to deliver the content and make it engaging for the students. So from the teachers section, we want to highlight 3 findings. The first is that even though the schools were closed, most countries reported that teachers were still required to work, often having to be flexible and adapt to these new circumstances, and with mostly no change to their salaries or their benefits. There are some differences across income groups where 90% of high income countries reported teachers having to teach during the closures as opposed to 40% in the lower income countries. Teachers were also able to teach from the school premises in about half of the high-income countries and 25% of the middle-income countries to ensure that they could benefit from the school resources in order to deliver their lessons, for example, for a better, more stable internet connection. Sometimes they're also required to teach from the premises when they were working with children of frontline workers, for example. The second message is that the educational crisis has called for an increased demand for human resources at the school level. So additional teachers were hired in 1 out of 3 countries, although more in high and middle income countries. Reasons for doing so included bringing aboard teachers with the required digital skills to operate the distance learning platforms, as well as to help with the return to classrooms. For example, when there was a policy put in place to reduce the density of the classroom, which required the splitting of the classes and then therefore requiring more teachers. Now, apart from teachers, additional personnel were also hired. Those included IT technicians in order to ensure the proper functioning of the platforms, as well as psychologists and pedagogical experts to support teachers and students during these difficult times. For the safe reopening of schools, which we will see in the upcoming section, 1 in 4 countries reported hiring additional personnel, such as cleaning and administrative staff. The return to school has created a different environment that requires more people to be around. And the third message with regard to teachers is that with these continued school closures, whether they are nationwide or partial closures, teachers do need better support. As we see in the figure, the survey results showed that this support to teachers indeed varied by income group. At the very least, countries provided some instructions to teachers on how to operate and deliver lessons through distance learning. But where we see more variability across the countries is with regards to the services, such as offering a special training to teachers, so the blue bar, psychological and emotional support to the gray bar, equipping them with a proper ICT tools, as well as maybe subsidies so that they could cover their internet subscriptions. That's the purple bar. And of course, unsurprisingly, more common in high and upper middle income countries. Regular interaction between teachers, students, and their parents was definitely encouraged during the closures, which takes us to the next section on parental support and engagement. The survey reveals that 9 in 10 countries put in place some kind of policy to encourage this regular interaction between the parents, the students, and the teachers. The most common across all income groups was to keep in touch through text messaging and the use of applications that allow for group conversations like WhatsApp. Phone calls and emails were less common, and home visits were not an approach that was generally used, which is normal given the nature of the pandemic. Moving on to the next point on the relationship between the home environment and learning outcomes. The pandemic has further amplified the importance of the home environment and the role of parents and caregivers for continuing learning. And recognizing this importance, the survey did dedicate a section, albeit small, to better understand the kinds of supports that were given to parents and caregivers so they could ensure that their children continued to learn, and who also had a very tough role, and still do in many cases, of juggling between their jobs, their house chores, and helping their children with their schoolwork. So the survey revealed that many governments shared guidance materials with parents to facilitate home-based learning, as well as tips to continue to stimulate and play with their kids. And that was particularly relevant for the younger children, where distance learning was either not available or it was just not working. And then before closing this section on effective distance learning, we wanted to recall that that schools are not the only place for learning. They provide critical services for school children, such as nutrition and protection. And the figure below shows us just a second. I'm sorry, I lost the figure. Oh yeah, thanks, Annette. So the figure below shows us the kinds of economic and well-being supports that are provided by governments to children and their families. We see that in about a quarter of the countries, governments reported providing meals and rations to families, as well as some financial support to the households. And these types of supports are often critical for parents and caregivers who are taking on additional responsibilities while also facing economic hardship. The provision of psychological support as well as child services were also provided by governments, although we do see stark differences across income groups. So the effects of these extended closures on students and their parents, combining those with lockdowns and economic instability, they have been substantial. And future iterations of the survey will continue to monitor the psychological supports to well-being and better mental health. This aligns with the joint statement that was recently published by UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Health Organization, and the World Food Programme on the importance of investing in health and well-being of children and adolescents, as well as with the Global Education Meeting Declaration, which was signed 2 weeks ago by governments, where they called for the safe reopening of educational institutions and for restoring access to basic services such as school meals, wash facilities, and social protection. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Maya and Kali. You've covered a lot of ground on that, and I saw that the chat was also very active. And thanks to colleagues for also being responsive. I think there's lots of resources in there. There are a set of comments and questions, some specifically on the segment here, and I'll start with those. And there are others which are perhaps more general. Also relating to methodology, and I think that's also important for us to address, either now in this part or we leave it for the very end. On the remote learning, I mean, just to summarize, Kali, a few of the points you made. That, I mean, basically almost all countries surveyed had some form of distance learning. That in most cases this was online. And TV online widely used, in particular in higher income countries, but there are equity issues in all contexts. And there is a question about, obviously, a general question that everyone is pondering on, is on the effectiveness of distance learning. So a question that is both a question to you, Kali, on that, but also perhaps a more general question about the methodology. What do we know about the effectiveness? And is effectiveness perceived effectiveness by the respondents to our survey? And how much of that is actually based on data that they are collecting in terms of the effectiveness of continued learning? So maybe first to you, Kali, on that.
Yes, sure. I'm happy to answer that. I do want to just say I will also turn the, I guess, the mic over to my colleague Tigran, as there was a question on the inclusion and what effort we made. On the effectiveness, yes, we do want to emphasize the survey is responding to the perceived effectiveness. And again, given who was responding, this is about those on the supply side. There are a lot of questions on the demand side. What I tried to highlight is why this survey did not delve into that. We do have other data, such as the high frequency household surveys or phone surveys, if you will, in some countries that go into the sort of the take-up, if you will. And as someone rightly highlighted, there are issues there in terms of, even if you offer remote online learning, there are households where the students share the computer, and so not everyone's able to be online at the same time, and what has happened. So it seems to have worked better, again, where there are resources and infrastructure with the online learning. With other aspects of remote learning, television was a huge, there was greater opportunity there to sort of break up and repeat sessions, for example, in many countries, so that students who weren't able to get on at one time can get on at another. That helps sort of, address the question of equity. And there were also targeting of different cohorts, like we said, within the grades. So let me turn it over to Tigran, if you don't mind, so to answer the question on inclusion.
Yes, there was one, hi colleagues, there was one question about inclusion and about how countries responded to support students with disabilities. We have a little bit of this topic in one of the questions that covered the ways or measures to support students at risk of exclusion from remote learning. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, the majority or the most popular measure was to support to learners with disabilities. Overall, globally, it's 56% of countries that responded said that they are supporting children with disabilities, and on a higher end, it's high-income countries with 63% of them doing it, and on lower end, it's low-income countries with 33% of doing it. What we don't know is exactly what measures were taken, but this could lay the ground for additional analysis inside countries or regions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tigran, for that. Maya, maybe one question. I mean, you started with support to teachers. And when we speak about, the need for greater resilience of our education systems, I mean, teachers, it's their responsiveness, their flexibility, their capacity to adapt to changing and uncertain circumstances and changing circumstances. But there was a question just to specify whether the survey looked into increased working time for teachers and education professionals during the period of closures.
Thanks, Sobi. I believe so. Both the first and the second survey looked at the increased demands on teachers, as well as what kind of policies were put in place to support them. Future discussions on the future iteration of the survey will look a little bit deeper into the skills development and will touch back on the experience that teachers have had in order to come up to speed with the new ways of having to deliver their lessons. But in a nutshell, yes, there is some stuff on increased time and demands, as well as on salaries and benefits and how those changed or not.
Okay, thanks, Maya, for that, and thanks, colleagues. There are a few other points, but I suggest we perhaps come back to them at the end so that we can move to the third and last segment of presentation of the survey data, and that covers the safe reopening of schools, managing the reopening of schools, the health protocols, but also questions around financing. So we will have two of our colleagues presenting, Annika from UNICEF and Dita from the UNICEF Innocenti Office of Research. So 10 minutes on the reopening of schools, what we have learned from the data, on the safe reopening, on health protocols, and on the question of financing. We'll then again have 10 minutes for questions and answers, and however much time we have left to come back to questions that might relate more generally to the survey or to other segments. So over to you, Annika.
Thanks, Sobi. This is Dita. I'll start off the session and pass on to Annika.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks,
as Sobi mentioned, in this section, we're looking at the progress that countries are making towards reopening their schools. And that's, of course, recognizing what has been covered previously in this presentation. So recognizing the learning loss from extended school closures, the impact of it, and that many children have not been reached by learning continuity efforts. The figure that you're seeing here combines information from UNESCO's global monitoring of school closures as of the 15th of September to show whether countries have reopened schools. And so that was combined with information that countries provided in the joint survey about whether or not they had set a date for the reopening of schools. So it shows us that most countries, which is encouraging. So 3 out of 4 countries at that point had reopened their schools, either fully or partially, with another 5% having set a reopening date in the future, after 15th of September. However, almost 1 in 4 countries had either missed a previously set date, so they nominated a date for reopening in the joint survey, but they had not reopened by that point, or weren't able to report a planned reopening date. Those are your orange and blue sections of the bar graphs that you're seeing there. And again, there were significant differences by income groups. While almost all high-income countries, or 9 out of 10 high-income countries, had reopened schools, only around 2 out of 3 low and middle-income countries had done so. And compared to other income groups, low-income countries were more likely to have faced delays in their reopening. So that being, you know, they reported reopening date that they missed by the time, according to the UNESCO Global Monitoring of School Closures. If we go to the next slide, we could see that some of the differences can be explained, and at least in part, when we look at the differences in how countries are planning on returning to school, looking at the teaching and learning approaches when schools reopen. Low-income countries are much more likely to be working towards returning for a full return to in-person teaching and learning. Meanwhile, most high and upper middle income countries are using a hybrid approach combining distance and in-person learning. I mean, this trend in turns, we think, you know, you can align with earlier findings in the survey about the differences in how countries have been able to implement remote learning to an extent that's considered an efficient substitute for official school days. One final observation we had in how countries are managing school reopening was that most low-income countries were prioritizing by grade or school level, and that's commonly by reopening to upper secondary school students first. Some countries noted that this was to allow students in terminal years, so last years of schooling, to sit for their exams. Meanwhile, when high-income countries are reopening by level, which doesn't happen as frequently, they're more likely to prioritize primary or pre-primary schools. And finally, compared to other income groups, high and upper middle income countries are more likely to be prioritizing reopening by geographic area, and it's mostly based on the prevalence of local transmissions of COVID-19 in those areas. And with that, I'm passing on to my colleague Annika, who will go through the health and financing considerations of reopening.
Thanks, Dita, and hello everyone. Thanks for being with us today. So health and hygiene measures are critical for the safe reopening of school, and the survey results reflect this. Nearly 100% of responding countries reported that they had produced or endorsed specific health and hygiene measures for schools. Most countries were planning to implement a wide variety of health measures, and in the graph on this page, you can see 10 specific measures that we asked about. And we've grouped them by sort of different category. And so the first category in blue is measures to reduce the person-to-person transmission of the virus. And we see that almost 100% of countries are including measures to promote physical distancing and hand washing practices within schools. Slightly fewer, 8 out of 10, are promoting good respiratory hygiene, such as use of masks in school. In the second category, orange, we have measures to reduce exposure to the virus, exposure contact. And we see again about 86% of countries are improving their hand washing facilities. Slightly fewer, 74%, have measures to increase cleaning and disinfection at their schools. And just below half of countries are improving their management of infectious waste. The last category is a group of measures to sort of detect and respond to virus exposure or infection at the school level. And we see 3 measures that have sort of a similar rate of prevalence. Between 56 and 66% of countries are including measures to take temperature checks at school, to track infected or exposed staff and students, and for those exposed staff and students to self-isolate. Far fewer, or 19%, which is less than 1 in 5 countries, are planning to test for COVID in schools. looking at sort of the height of these bar graphs, you can see that a lot of countries are implementing a lot of measures. And on average, we saw in most income groups that countries were implementing, including about 7 of these measures in their health and hygiene guidelines. In low income countries, this was slightly lower for an average of 6. So if we can go to the next slide. So in relation to these measures, countries were asked whether they had sufficient resources, commodities, and infrastructure to ensure the safety of all learners and staff when they return to school. And overall, we see that 74% of countries reported that they did. There is a gap by income level, though. You see that though 95% of high income countries said they had these sufficient resources, only 50% or lower of the low income and lower middle income country groups said that they did. We also asked countries what the source of funding for these school safety measures were. And in all but 3 countries who reported this data, government allocations were a source of funding. This was supplemented by funding from external donors in 1 out of 2 countries. But that varied by income level. So 80% of low and lower middle income countries reported external funding to support school safety measures. And this brings us sort of to the last topic we'll discuss, which is education financing in relation to COVID-19. In almost all countries, they reported that additional funds have been provided to cover increases in costs related to the COVID-19 education response. This graph here breaks down the source of that funding and also by income group. And so we see with the orange bar on the right in the global column that 71% of all reporting countries received additional government funds to support the education response. This was supplemented pretty evenly by, in the gray bar, reallocation within the existing education budget to the COVID-19 response, as well as in the blue bar, external donor funding. The trends are somewhat constant across some of the income groups, but we see in particular that in low income countries, external donors are playing a larger role, contributing to the resources to fund the COVID-19 response. And in higher income countries, external donors are playing less of a role. Next slide, please. The survey also asked a few additional questions about changes in education budget. The response rate to those questions was about half of the countries, so the interpretation of these last few points is more limited in that regard. But within this subset of responding countries, 19% of countries reported cuts made to their education budgets in 2020 or planned for 2021, with a greater share in low and lower middle income countries. About 42% of countries in those groups reported cuts or planned cuts. This graph depicts the percentage of countries in blue who reported budget declines in the education sector wage bill, and in orange who reported budget declines in school feeding programs. A few other countries also mentioned that their operations budget, their school operations budgets would be cut. And so here in this graph, we see fairly similar trends. 11 or 14% of these responding countries reporting cuts to either the wage bill or school feeding budget. And we see a higher level within the group of lower middle income countries. We also had a question about whether countries were increasing particular budgets, and 40% of these responding countries indicated that they had increased or were expecting to increase government support to households in 2020 or in 21. And this primarily included plans for conditional cash transfers or scholarships or school loans to help households maybe meet some of the challenges that they're facing due to economic shocks and support their children's return to school. And these were the main findings from this section.
Thank you very much for that, Dita and Annika. A couple of questions coming in. Let me start with the financing where we ended. And there is a question. There was a more general question, actually, based on your present or address to you, Dita, was to say, is it correct to say that lower income countries are more concerned by the cost of discontinued, educational discontinuity for older students, upper grades, and in high income countries, there seems to be more attention paid to the impact and the costs of discontinuity at lower levels and early grades. Dita?
Thanks, Ovid, and thanks for that question. Some countries did provide additional information, like free text information. Not all, a few did. And certainly what I remember seeing was amongst high-income countries that were reopening to pre-primary schools, one reason that came up a few times was the role, it's parents. It's about ensuring that parents are able to return to work, so parents with younger children in particular. And beyond that, I think some of the reasons that came up in that question seems about right. I mean, certainly even from the first wave of the survey, the importance that of upper secondary students being able to sit their completion examination and therefore join the workforce, etc., is often raised as an important consideration, particularly in lower income countries. And I think I also remember seeing in the chat, on the other side of it, for pre-primary children, the particular challenge of engaging them through remote learning. I think that's about right.
Okay, an additional question on financing that's just come in, actually pointing out a little bit of a paradox or a contradiction. That if the survey is reported, and we know that the survey has gone to national education authorities, and our focal points there have reported increased resources for education during the COVID-19 disruption. How can that be explained when we know the economic impact of COVID, and the fact that so little is actually being allocated to education and the stimulus and recovery packages? It's a question that's open to any of the colleagues who would like to comment on that.
I mean, I think the survey sort of tells us what countries told us. I'll sort of say again that the sample size for those questions was much more limited. And it clearly there were big expenses in terms of responding immediately, getting distance learning going, etc. So maybe countries moved some things around, but there may also be people on this call who can give some examples from in their countries what was done that might shed light on this question.
Yeah, a comment to say that it might not be additional funds, but reprioritizing and shifting existing resources. All right. A question just to bring us back. I mean, we started with in this last segment on the safe reopening, and there was a comment at the very beginning of the webinar, basically on what is our position and on the importance of having schools open. And I think it's been made clear by I mean the three partners, organizations, and other development partners that of the importance of schools to be open on condition, safety, hygiene, security measures are ensured. And importance of schools, as was mentioned, because beyond the studies and the learning, for all the services that are provided, health services, nutrition, school feeding programs, for the protection that it provides, in particular for for girls and learners from more vulnerable communities, and also in terms of the socialization that the school space provides. But a question, because we're seeing now a new phase, at least where we're sitting, where I'm sitting, and some of the colleagues in Europe, where we are going into lockdown, back into something like a full confinement, but with schools or certain levels of the education system open and others remote. So that my question is, has the thinking, I mean, this is beyond the survey, but has the thinking about safety and hygiene in this in this moment, has that evolved? We had first a moment of kind of full confinement, full closures in many instances. And then we saw a reopening with much more localized kind of responses, depending essentially on what the health situation was in a local, in a region, in a locality, in a community. And based on that, to make decisions on how school reopening would be managed. And now we have a third type of scenario with, like, you know, confinement, kind of full confinement, but schools or parts of the education system open. I'm just wondering if our thinking on hygiene, safety measures as part of school reopening has evolved. A question perhaps to UNICEF colleagues.
I can step in. I think, yes, it seems a little bit that in practice it certainly has. And from my own personal experience of you know, my nephew is in quarantine right now because there was exposure in his school. Schools and districts are reacting to the infection rates that they see in their counties, in their districts, in their communities, and making decisions. And there's some stop and go, and that makes it very difficult. Sometimes also for teachers and for parents to react. But it does seem like there is sort of this also subnational decision making happening, sort of weighing the risks and you know, what are certain levels of infection rates, what's happening here to make decisions. And different countries are prioritizing maybe slightly differently. In Europe, for example, there really is this priority on keeping schools open and maybe closing other parts of the economy to make that more manageable. But Nicola or others, please feel free to step in.
Okay.
So perhaps I can come in a little bit based on what we've seen with the monitoring of school closures and reopening efforts at UNESCO, the map that everybody's familiar with. And what we've seen, particularly in the last 2 weeks, we've seen a shift from about 500 million students still subject to full school closures, to about shrunk in half. So now the number of children impacted by full school closures is about 230 million as of the 1st of November. Numbers should be updated on the website very soon. And countries moving more towards partial reopening. So the intention is positive, and the intention is to reopen schools. And we still stand at about 40% of the global student population that's fully back in school. So just thought.
Yeah, thanks for that, Maya. While I have you, there was one question just in terms of clarifying definitions. What do we mean when we say partial?
All right. So partially open means, according to what we've tried to make sense out of it, one of three things. The first is that reopening is done in some regions or some areas or some districts of the country generally linked with the overall sanitary conditions and the number of infections in that region. So that's one type. A second type is there is a prioritization of grades. So reopening for what we see most common is reopening for those students who will be undertaking examinations. We have also seen at the beginning of the pandemic reopening for the younger children. So that's another type. And a third type is pretty much nationwide use of a hybrid approach of mixing both in-person instruction with online learning. Not the most common. It's in about 14 countries. 40 million students that are currently in that hybrid approach. So that's partial reopening.
Okay, thanks for that, Maya. I'd like to there's one more question, and I might like to turn to Matt to that. But there were questions on, how much do we know about learners with disabilities in this particular context. There was a question about what do we know about learners from indigenous communities. Basically, what do we know about those who are not being reached? And Matt, you might like to come in on this.
Yeah, I mean, the survey was asking mainly a question about how much government have put policies for inclusiveness of their answers, regardless of the type of groups that were like disadvantaged. So I think in the round 3, we can try to have more granularity on this question. What I want to say though also is related to a question I think Jason in the chat asked about how many people were reached by remote learning solutions. Remote learning solutions that government have put in place are basically 3 things: online learning, TV and radio programs, and in cases where there is not even electricity, take-home paper-based package. If we look at the estimate that we have done, based on round 1, and I'm sure with round 3 we can fine-tune this estimate, potentially making it even more robust and see some changes compared to round 1. But using round 1 data of the survey plus the household assets, meaning does household have TV, radio, computers, connectivity, etc. It is striking numbers. Only at maximum a quarter of low and middle income countries, children in low and middle income countries were able to have access to potentially online learning. So it means 75% didn't, at least. And of course, 75% are in the poorest countries and are in the poorest household of rich countries. If you add TV and radio, it got better, like up to 2/3 of children potentially being reached by either digital learning or TV radio, but still 31%, a bit more than 31% being excluded. And again, who are they? They are the poorest. They are those in the most disadvantaged areas, and etc. Over to you.
Thanks for that, Matt. And just to connect to that, perhaps one last question for me. We're approaching, and we have about 10 minutes left before we go to some conclusions and kind of the next steps. But perhaps to Sylvia, I mean, on this question of, regardless of the combination of remote learning strategies, including, as Matt was mentioning, paper-based, print packages, take-home packages, and radio, TV, and online. We know that there is a process of disengagement, and the longer that interruption of learning, the more likelihood that disengagement will lead to dropout. Sylvia, if you're still with us, what do we know about tracking re-enrollment when schools reopen?
Yes, and thank you so much, and thank you for all the questions. It's very exciting to see the chat, and we're trying to reply, and we don't have enough hands to actually to try to go to that. We're really going to take seriously and take your comments on board for also for the next iteration. The UIS actually in our data collection, we have asked the countries already what are the mechanisms that they have into place. There are good efforts also done by the World Bank and UNICEF and other agencies that are trying to actually to look at that. We know that this engagement is a real happening, and the students get disengaged. And as Maya said, the countries are still committed to open the school and to keep this as an environment where the kids are going, and probably the only main social interaction that is happening in this moment are schools. So we are going to have a rapid data collection and trying to track on this return to school now, and just not looking at the policies, but effectively on enrollment. So it's something that we're going to be administering soon with the third iteration accompanying this to try to see how the countries are doing. We already have for more than 120 countries, they have shared with us with methods they are using. So we're trying to actually to learn from there and to try to shape and to collect the data. So we're going to have, so stay tuned and help us by responding to the survey. And we're trying to get data on this on a real time, as much as we could real time to have in this context. Thank you, Sophie.
Great, thank you, Sylvia. Omar, you might like to come in on this point as well.
Yeah, thank you. Just quickly to complement, so at the bank we also have participated. Our team has participated on a series of fund surveys that have been implemented by our colleagues in the poverty and equity global practice. We were able to include a very short module on this question of engagement with remote learning. And so this is kind of a different source, not just want to highlight because it complements, I think, the findings from this joint survey. I mean, the results are pretty much consistent in the sense that the reach and coverage of the remote learning efforts has been very, very limited. Even if one considers multimodal, so radio, TV, digital, is really a small fraction and is as you can imagine, hugely unequal. And there are, even for those who have had some form of access, the engagement piece is also a big constraint. So kids and parents really struggling. And again, I think many of us can sort of confirm that with our own remote learning experience with our kids, even in places where digital connectivity and the preparedness of the school systems was supposed to be much better. So I think this is really a huge issue. We're finishing a qualitative study to try to understand more of the constraints that have really been faced by countries, and that should be completed. That we're doing it in around 10 countries. But pretty much this is a huge issue, and I think it's a big lesson coming from the crisis, that resilience of systems really depend hugely on countries upping up their games in this area. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Omar. We are really reaching the end. We've got about 5 minutes left. As Sylvia was saying, the chat has been very active. I haven't been even been able to keep up with the questions coming in. And as Sylvia was saying, not enough fingers and two hands for those of you who are responding. But I think many important points. I'd like to hand it over just for a kind of concluding remarks, wrap up, but also some idea of the next steps. As was mentioned earlier, the technical team of the three organizations are meeting tomorrow already on a third iteration of the survey. The situation evolves, and your insights and your comments during the chats have also been very useful in pointing some of the important points. I'd like to hand it over now to Nicolas Rouge from UNICEF in New York, and João Pedro Azevedo from the World Bank to conclude and wrap up this webinar. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Sobi. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, thank you. And I was saying to the organizers of the panel before starting that I might have some noise issue because they are doing some construction work in my street. So the sound might not be as good as it was during the test before. But anyway, I will not last long. And I would say, what the path? What the path? Because at least 9 months ago, we didn't even know that the pandemic would last that long and would require enhanced mid and long-term monitoring of the education response worldwide, and raise. I mean, this raised the necessity to really joint our effort for data collection and analysis. So, as Sylvia and Matt were saying in the introduction, we moved from an agency-specific data collection. In UNICEF, we started quite early to have internal data collection with our country office. I know UNESCO did the same. I think the bank did the same as well. And then we moved progressively towards something more consistent. The first survey got 118 countries response, but we did, separate analysis. The second round had 149 countries participating, and we did a joint analysis, this report that we were happy to present today. And I think that the growing number of countries responding must be taken also as a signal for the growing interest from the countries and from the international community to have that kind of information available for better preparing and implementing the education response to social crisis. I would just say here, first of all, this wouldn't have been possible without our partner in the country. So I would like to take this occasion to really thank all the countries who took the time, who asked their staff members to respond to this survey. I know it's time consuming, but it was really helpful. And without your involvement, we wouldn't have been able to produce this analysis in such a short timeline. Let me continue by saying that the report is there, but the analysis continues. And of course, we presented here some global trends, but there are a lot of details in the data, and we continue the data analysis in each of the agencies. We continue, to feed some research paper in UNICEF, in the regional offices as well. I know some works are ongoing, but the data are public. So we hope that this presentation will have, strengthen the appetite of other organizations to dig in the data, take them and analyze them, and propose secondary analysis, other analysis, in order to complement what we've been saying. It's been a great collaboration with our respective institution here presenting, but it's also been a great exercise internally in UNICEF. When we talk about UNICEF, I would like to emphasize that this work didn't engage just education division in the headquarters, but also the data and analytics division, our office of research, of course, and also, but not least, our country offices were asked to, work with some our national counterpart when responding the survey, to support the survey, the data collection process, and also our regional offices. I would say in particular our network of education research and data specialists in the regional offices, who contributed to shape the questionnaire for this second iteration as well as for the first iteration. Now we know that the challenges continue, and countries will continue to monitor how the situation evolves. We also took note about, some comment which can give some insight and orientation for the definition of the third round. As Sylvia was mentioning, and as Sobi reminded it, we are going to propose a third round, and obviously we will seek to have many more rounds in the future, probably making this survey evolve from a COVID-19 dedicated response to something more, more relevant for the long-term programming and monitoring. And probably, use this opportunity to better monitor new focus for education. I was talking about remote learning, but also blended approaches. There is a lot of appetite and emphasis also better monitoring for school reopening. So we have a lot of complementarity of work here, and we will definitely seek the opportunity of this survey to feed all those boxes. In addition to the other ongoing efforts that try to strengthen our approach to those questions. And I would say that beyond data collection from a global perspective, we really wish to strengthen our collaboration with the bank, with UNESCO, with UIS in the field, in the global area of data system and research work. So I will end up with that, and just also thank you all the participants to this webinar. I think it's really great to have so many people and such an interactive chat with regard to this subject. And I'm giving the floor to my colleague in the World Bank. Thanks a lot. João?
Oh, you need to unmute.
Well, thank you so much for all of you who have joined us today in this webinar. And I must second, I think on behalf of all of us, Nicolas' words thanking the government officials for providing the answers to these questions, taking the time, and for the teachers, parents, and students who are really engaged in this moment, right, which is of an unprecedented crisis. I think what this crisis is showing us, I think, in an unprecedented way, is that data is critical to plan our responses, right? And what this this joint effort shows is that we must collaborate across institutions and with countries, with governments, to collect this data in the most timely and effective way. And most importantly, produce the analysis equally fast, right? Because this is a situation that is evolving by the hour in many countries. And as we moved in transition to this new phase of the crisis, in which educational systems are going to be opening and closing in a very fluid way, I think we're going to have to complement our data, the collection, our monitoring efforts in order to be equally agile and be able to capture the nuances and this changing reality on the ground in real time, or as precisely as possible. This is a challenge that countries will have, because more and more, I think, countries are being encouraged to be thinking locally and empowering in a more decentralized ways the responses on how and when to close schools and what modes to choose to do that. And we need to find a way in order to capture this information, in order to understand the overall trends, the overall effects, and to identify what works, right? I think that is going to be a critical element. In this survey so far, in this work, we have captured the perceptions and the de jure, the policy intent of governments. But as we progress, we need to be able to capture the take-up of these policies, the implementation of these policies, what is actually happening on the ground, and eventually, of course, the learning losses, the actual losses, and the impact. Now, we know from what we have seen is that this channel, right, of this transmission channel of our effect has many potential problems, right, in terms of the ability of the households to take advantage of a lot of these responses, the actual behavior of the households in taking up some of these policy efforts. And all of that has to be monitored. And I think we want very much to continue the collaboration to do that in the upcoming months, and share that with you in a very rapid way. I think as we said, we are very much in a mode of opening not just the results and the data, but also the code. And for that, we have created this GitHub page, which we've shared in our chat, and it's in our presentation as well, which basically allows anyone to basically look at the data, look at the documentation of the data, check the questionnaire, but also download the code that we actually use to produce the analysis in this report. And as Nicolas said, build upon that and do their own analysis, right? This is not the last word about the situation. As I said, this is a very fluid challenge. And we need many eyes. We need many eyes. We need many views. We need to triangulate this, and we need the help of this great community that got together here today. I mean, we are over 500 people that have stayed with us over an hour and a half, and I hope very much that, I think on behalf of all of us, that this is the beginning of a conversation, and we want to continue to share and continue to learn from all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye. Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.